As the temps start rising, I feel the familiar urge to refresh my closet, but I don't want to waste money on pieces I'll only wear once or for just one season. Thankfully, Quince changes that. Their clothes are timeless, lightweight, and far more elevated than anything else at this price. It finally feels like my wardrobe matches my standards. The best part is that Quince only works with factories that use safe, ethical, and responsible manufacturing practices and premium fabrics and finishes, so you get to look good while feeling good. I'm pretty excited that I have upgraded my athleisure wardrobe for this summer. I bought a sweatshirt and a pair of wide-leg flow pants that are two of the softest items I own, and I plan to live in them. So join me in giving your summer closet an upgrade with Quince. Go to quince.com/POTC for free shipping on your order and 365-day returns. That's QUINCE.com/POTC to get free shipping and 365-day returns. Quince.com/POTC.
When we talk about American society, there's always a lot of emphasis put on gender and ethno-racial inequality. That's not new. But if you take this broader lens of not only status, the concept of status normally has to do with how people measure up in socioeconomic terms. But I take instead the concept of worth, which is more multidimensional, which is really about, what kind of currencies we use to determine who's worthy and who's not. And for the groups that are least valued, what can be done to transform how they are perceived so that cultural membership or a feeling of belonging and mattering can be extended to the widest number.
That was Michele Lamont on Psychologists Off the Clock.
We are four experts in psychology here to bring you cutting-edge and science-based ideas from psychology to help you flourish in your relationships, work, and health.
I'm Dr. Debbie Sorensen, a clinical psychologist practicing in Mile High, Denver, Colorado, and author of Act for Burnout, Act Daily Journal, and the Act Daily Card Deck.
From America's Heartland, I'm Dr. Emily Edlin, a clinical psychologist based in Chicago, Illinois, and author of Autonomy Supportive Parenting.
Calling in from Vienna, Austria, I'm Michael Herold, ACT coach, confidence trainer, and author of an upcoming book on being a better conversationalist and making friends.
And from coastal New England, I'm Dr. Jill Stoddard, author of Be Mighty, The Big Book of ACT Metaphors, and Imposter No More.
We hope you take what you learn here to build a rich and meaningful life.
Thank you for listening to Psychologists Off the Clock.
Hi, everyone. This is Debbie, and I'm here today to bring you a conversation with Dr. Michele Lamont. She's a sociology professor, which, we like to sometimes go outside of the field of psychology. And so this time we're talking to someone in the closely related field of sociology. And we talked today mostly about her new book, which is called Seeing Others: How Recognition Works and How It Can Heal a Divided World. And I think that in the conversation, we talk about a topic that we have covered on the podcast before. In fact, I'm here with Michael today, and you recently had an episode with Dr. Janina Scarlett about sort of that feeling on the individual level of when you feel unseen, unheard, undervalued, and just how that impacts us. And in this conversation today, we talk about the same idea, but more at the group and the cultural level. And so we talk about how certain groups of people are overlooked, undervalued, unrecognized within our society compared to other groups, and how that really is a cultural issue. And it's one that has an impact on people's lives. And Michael, you listened to the conversation, and I know that you had some personal reactions to the conversation, and it kind of got you thinking about some personal examples from your life.
Yes, so there was one part in particular that stood out to me, mostly because it is now so much better than it used to be. That was my first realization. I'll tell you what the part specifically was in a bit. And the other thing I realized was how horrible that was many years ago. And this is the portrayal of minorities in public media, in books, in TV shows, and in movies. She mentions this TV show, which I haven't seen, but it sounds fantastic, called Transparent, which apparently is about a transgender dad and his family. And it made me think of the amazing books that I've recently read where you had minorities in the book, especially in the transgender area, where this would be a novel and there's just a transgender person as one of the cast. And they're not the main character in the story. It's not about them. There's just a he, there's a she, and there's a they. And I just found that so beautiful how this happens more and more in media, in books, how these minorities are not highlighted as a minority. They are just part of our society. They are just a part of it. And that was so different growing up. So for me, I remember when someone with a disability would make their way into a television show or a movie, they would be the main character and the story would be about their disability. And nowadays you can watch TV shows, movies, and there is a person with a disability and it's just there. It doesn't need mentioning. It doesn't need explaining. It doesn't need pointing out. It's just part of the story. And Debbie, because we're both Lego enthusiasts at times, and there are even Lego sets now that have minifigurines that are using a wheelchair. And this is not a hospital set. It's just a regular funfair. It's just a regular something. And you have a blonde minifigurine, and you have a dark-haired minifigurine, and you have a kid minifigurine. You have one with glasses, and you have one in a wheelchair. And I find that is really something I wish I had seen more as a kid, because for me, growing up in the German language in the 80s and the 90s, disability or being disabled was a negative word. That's what you would call traffic that was going slow on the highway. It was disabled traffic. A TV show that wasn't good was disabled. To this day, I hear people say, "Oh, I don't like this. This is totally disabled." And I was the kid growing up with that self-story. Self-story is something else that Michèle talks about in her book. And for me, part of my self-story is that A, I'm disabled, and B, disabled is bad, because that's how the word is used. And that really stood out for me in the book and kind of like made me proud to see we still have a very long way to go, but I don't want to downplay how far we've come with that already. So as someone living with a disability, I'm really glad to see the change in the media.
Yeah, I love what you're saying here. First of all, representation matters, right? It humanizes us. You know, that more accurately reflects the world that we actually live in. And so to have these movies and books and TV shows where we're just seeing the humanity of people that are often overlooked. I mean, I think she talks to change agents, people who are doing this work of representation, and that matters because then you start to see people. I was thinking about when you shop online and you see different body sizes and, you know, I feel like when I was a kid, it was all blonde, tall, thin people, you know, and it's like, that's shifted. It's not, there's still a ways to go, but you know, when I'm shopping online, you see different bodies and different, you know, types of people. And that's more accurate, right? What the world reflects the world. And yeah, I mean, in English too, I could make a list and I won't because it would be a pretty upsetting to look at or to say out loud, but of words, exactly what you're talking about. It's a word that is kind of a derogatory term toward a specific group of people, and it's used as an insult. It's used as a negative. And so then we form that association, you know. Yeah. I mean, probably everybody listening could make a list of words like that. And what does that teach people when we're using words that describe a person or are associated with a person or a group of people, and we're using it as an insult?
So that was the part that really stood out for me. And Debbie, like you talk about so many good things with Michèle, like you cover so many topics that I think are just equally important to take in and think about.
And I think that what she's trying to do feels to me like a very hard problem, right? Which is to shift some of these narratives and help groups of people be more seen and valued. And yet, when I read her book and when I talked to her, I actually ended up feeling more hopeful. And sometimes that's what I'm looking for in a book when it addresses culture level problems is, yes, I know there's problems out there. I want a little bit of hope and a sense of maybe I can do something that matters. And so I do think if you listen to the interview all the way through, you'll end up on a hopeful note as well. Michele Lamont is a professor of sociology and of African and African American studies at Harvard University, where she is also the Robert I. Goldman Professor of European Studies. And quick side note, I was just telling Michele that I was in the psychology department at Harvard and was in the same building. The psychology and sociology departments are in the same building. So she's actually talking to me from my old stomping grounds from back in graduate school. So it's fun to see a little glimpse back in William James Hall through the camera here. As an influential cultural sociologist who studies boundaries and inequality, Michele has tackled topics such as dignity, respect, stigma, racism, class, and racial boundaries, and how we evaluate social worth across societies. She served as the 108th president of the American Sociological Association, and her research has received numerous awards, including honorary doctorates from 6 countries. She is the author or co-author of over a dozen books, and her most recent book is called Seeing Others: How Recognition Works and How It Can Heal a Divided World. And I'm very excited to talk to you about this book today. Michele, welcome, and thanks for joining us.
Thank you so much for having me.
Well, I want to start very broadly with sort of the general concept that you offer in your book, which is about how groups of people, more so, I think in your book you focus on that more so than individuals, but certain groups within a culture are seen, valued, and recognized, whereas other groups are devalued, overlooked. They're just not sort of seen as important. And so I was wondering if you could just start us off by speaking broadly about this concept of how groups are valued within a society.
Sure. Experts in organization and work have come up with this concept of ideal worker. And the ideal worker is typically the white male who is able to work more than 40 hours a week. And this is the person on whom light is normally being shed in the context of workplace interaction. They're the people who get the awards, who get the kudos, and who are the ones sitting, far from the center of the floor plan. It's often members of older people who went back to the job market later in life, people who haven't had traditional trajectories. These are often women, older women, people of color. So that's just one context in which we can see this prism of the unequal attention. It's not only about discrimination and racism. It's very much, going beyond this and seeing, groups that may present as white, they can be viewed as the privileged group in society, are in fact quite undervalued, as is the case for older women who tend to be, discriminated against as well. So, of course, when we talk about American society, there's always a lot of emphasis put on gender and ethno-racial inequality. That's not new. But if you take this broader lens of not only status, the concept of status normally has to do with how people measure up in socioeconomic terms. But I take instead the concept of worth, which is more multidimensional, which is really about, what kind of currencies we use to determine who's worthy and who's not. And for the groups that are least valued, what can be done to transform how they are perceived so that cultural membership or a feeling of belonging and mattering can be extended to the widest number. So that's really the purpose of the book. It's very much oriented toward social change and toward helping the general reader understand why this is not just a question of ethno-racial group. It goes much beyond, and we need to think about how to broaden the circle of who matters.
Yeah, that's so interesting. And I think that I was just thinking about what groups of people have a voice too, a platform or are listened to. And, on the individual level, you might think of a meeting with a group of people and who has the respect and sort of who do people listen to in the group, who has power within that group, who talks, who's listened to, who's not. But you could also think of that really broadly. Do you think that kind of idea applies too?
maybe psychologists, or, you have the classical book by Deborah Tannen about interruptions and gender, in small group conversation. But that applies, this concept of cultural membership applies also not only to the face-to-face, but also to the pecking order of groups as they exist in our society. And this has huge implication for politics. So, for instance, just to take one example, much has been written about the white working class, which has experienced downward mobility with the decline of manufacturing, and how they respond to this in part by embracing white nationalism, the fact that being American is one of the characteristic that they have that is highly valued worldwide. And they associate this with whiteness and often as well with Christianity. And they're quite upset that other groups seem to be, illegitimately jumping up the line in front of them. So, and that is often used to explain a lot of what's happening in contemporary politics with the rise of Trump, for instance. But there are many other examples.
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm. And I want to talk to you later on in the conversation about what might be shifting recently in our world, because maybe it is shifting a little bit. Mm-hmm. In the meantime, though, can you talk a little bit about the impact when you are a member of a group that's denied recognition, as you say in your book, denied dignity and that sense of being valued within society? How do you think that impacts people in terms of their lives and their well-being?
It impacts at a great many levels. So to give you one example, epidemiologists have written really important work on what they call the allostatic load. That's a big word to say simply the wear and tear of inequality that gets under the skin. When you are experiencing immense stress on a daily basis because you don't know how you're going to feed your kids, or because you experience, microaggression all day as a person of color or as a queer person, this repeated stress really has a direct impact, not only on your subjective well-being, your mental health, but also on your physical health. So epidemiologists have written, for instance, about what they call John Henryism, which is the finding that African-American middle-class men have much worse health outcome than their white counterparts, because of this constant experience of microaggression, but also because they put a lot of stress on themselves to be able to measure up, given that they know that they have positions of responsibility. So that literature is enormous. So it has to do with health, but it had also to do with self-image, of course. If you struggle all day because you feel that people perceive you in a way that does not line up with your own perception of yourself. Du Bois, one of the great, classic analysts of race relations in the US, came up with this concept of double consciousness, which is in part about this struggle, between the self-perception. You think you are worthy and you belong, but yet if you live in a racist society, you're constantly being told that you don't. So this clash, this juncture really creates a lot of stress and tension. So that's the pathway, basically, all these stresses that adds up to affect all kinds of things, how likely you are to have hypertension. And there's huge literature on experience of racism and health outcomes that my colleague David Williams, for instance, at the School of Public Health has been working on.
Well, I think it's really interesting to have you particularly on the podcast because you're a sociologist, and I'd say a majority of our episodes and the guests that we've had have been more looking at the individual level, psychologists and psychology researchers and that kind of thing. There's a lot of overlap, but it takes a different view than psychology by looking more at that broader sociocultural level. And I think it's important probably to have a little of both. But why do you think that the individual level might not sort of be adequate to capture this concept? Where does psychology fall short, I guess is what I'm trying to ask here.
There's all kinds of ways to address the problems that I describe in the book. And, someone like Angela Duckworth, the psychologist who's reputed for having developed this concept of grit, grit is very much approached like a characteristic of the personality, something, that people, it's built in, but you can also cultivate it. But that's the alternative, instead of focusing on individual resilience, my book really focuses on social resilience, which is basically how we can create societies that give people the tools they need in order to, meet the challenges that come their way. That's how I define resilience. So, for instance, when a 32 state passed same-sex marriage law, we saw immediately a decline in the number of LGBTQ youths who attempted suicide. So that's an example where, your mental health, but also your conception of whether you deserve the best thing that society offers, such as marriage, the legalization of a long-term relationship, the fact of having the seal of approval immediately affected people's, desire to live. So it's really profound. And I focus on narratives as a tool for broadening how people understand their worth. There's a lot of other tools, like paying people more matters as well, of course. But narratives, provide us alternative stories about who matters. And we're exposed to narratives all the time when we watch TV, for instance, when we talk with people, when we go to church and hear a sermon. So in the book, I gave the example of the show Transparent, which is the story of an advanced middle-aged man who becomes trans. He becomes a woman, and then he has to negotiate his new identity with his grown children. And that show really humanizes what it is. You see the guy's existential conflict and his problem, and everyone, as a parent, identify with the fact that you want to have a good relationship with your children, So it points to what we all have in common, as opposed to looking at trans people as aberration. And when I interviewed Joy Soloway, who's the creator of this show, they told me exactly that. The goal was to make this group less aberrant so that people can relate and understand who they are. So the diffusion of stories and diffusion of meaning making, I'm a cultural sociologist, so this is what I study, how people make meaning of their world, and how they do this not in isolation, but in conversation with others by absorbing and relating to stories that are told to them. So, of course, some psychologists study this as well, but that is the focus of my book. I would say in general, sociologists, part of sociology is similar to psychology. We have something in sociology also called social psychology, which looks at the interpersonal level, and the concept of stigma, which is really central to the book, after all, is proposed by a guy named Erving Goffman, who writes mid-century, and that's a great classic of both the disciplines of psychology and sociology, because he's the one, there's huge literature on stigma, and he plays a central role in starting that line of research, as you know. There's overlap as well between our disciplines, yeah.
There is.
Or a difference in accent. And I think my subfield in some ways is more similar to anthropology, because it's really about how people make meaning of the world, But a lot of psychologists study that as well.
Yeah, there is overlap for sure. I think that I want to go back to this concept of narratives, because as a clinical psychologist, I often talk with individual clients I work with about narratives, but it's more kind of like self-stories. And often they are internalized cultural narratives that, those stories you've been hearing all around you for decades have seeped into you. But then my clients, we can do a little bit of work around perspective taking on some of those narratives. So there's overlap for sure. I think that's a good example of this, but I'm talking about your particular narratives that are kind of going through your mind, and you're talking about narratives in a different way. I think just those really broad cultural narratives that kind of get perpetuated over the course of time, right? So could you say a little bit more about that? Like, how do these narratives form and get so embedded in the culture?
Yeah, well, I think in therapy, most often people talk about the stories people tell themselves about themselves. Like, I've always failed in love. I will always fail in love. Nobody will always ever love me, for instance, just making up something. The narratives I'm interested in are in some ways more of a macro feature of our society. Like, for instance, the American dream would be a very good example. The American dream is a story about our collective identity and the history of the country, but it's also a story that immigrants embrace when they come to the U.S. and they say, I'm coming to the U.S. so that my kids can have a better future and they can become professional and go to college. This story has a lot of coherence. When I think about the American dream, I don't invent it entirely. It's something that's given to me, but it really has a deep impact on how people think about their self-concept. So in the book, I talk about something, it's a little wordy, but I talk about this neoliberal script of self. And that's a concept of who you are as a person that is promoted and diffused with this current phase of economic development, which has been called neoliberalism, which has to do with the state basically removing all the barriers to economic growth. And both Ronald Reagan and Margaret Thatcher in the UK and the US really played a very important role in transforming this. So, and with it come a concept of who we should be as people. And the book argues that as neoliberal people, we're supposed to be hyper competitive, extremely dynamic, having a super entrepreneurial attitude toward our future, agentic. We take it in our hands and we run. And the goal is, of course, to make money and to go up the social ladder and to be very successful and also to be very self-reliant. And the people who don't meet these criteria, for instance, people who are judged to not be self-reliant, low-income people, people who use welfare, are really looked down at. So one of the puzzles in the book is this neoliberal concept of self has come with a lot of downside, like as probably your listeners know, there's been a major epidemic in recent years in mental health problems, because this focus on competitiveness means that people put a lot of emphasis on work, and that feeds feelings of anxiety and also feeling overwhelmed. So there's an organization at UCLA that does every year a survey of first-year undergrads, and you look at their tables and you see that over the last decades, there's been very steep increase in the number of first-year undergrads who say that they feel absolutely overwhelmed. And that, as people who teach undergrads, we experience it daily because we're dealing with the mental health of students all the time, which was not the case when I started teaching many years ago. So the solution and the mental health problem translates also in the opioid epidemic, the book that was extremely influential by Case and Angus Deaton, that by Despair, that shows that even, lower middle class people, the opioid epidemic and the suicide that has increased a lot, the decline in life expectation, that expectancy that we've seen over the last few years is directly connected to this overemphasis on work. So the question I ask in the book is, what can we do to, instead of having one script of self, of who we should be, to have multiple, a plurality of script, so that, let's say, caregivers, parents who are taking care of their kids while working, this aspect of their life gets fully recognized and supported by employers. And there's research that shows, for instance, that if you take healthcare workers and you give them flexibility in time so that they can bring their elderly mother to the doctor, or they can take care of their kids when they're sick, this translates also in workers really feeling seen and feeling treated like they're humans by their employers. And it also translates into more loyalty toward the employer. And all together, it means the employer doesn't have to constantly find new employees, So it's a practice that really pays off for the employer as well. So we could go on and on, all the changes that could be made to allow people to feel seen, to have their personal needs that are not just productivity needs, to speak to, the needs of the employer, but also to have an employer that allows them to live in a way that is more humane, frankly.
I want to unpack something a little bit here, that you have two separate chapters related to this idea of the American dream and how it impacts people. One is about those people you're talking about who are striving and who are chronically stressed out because they're trying to reach that top of the American dream status, whether it's school or work or achievement, and how stressful that treadmill is for people. And then also the people who, are not on that treadmill, who are maybe, poor or are just not, quote, making it in that particular way, but that they're looked at as like they failed. They couldn't cut it. So they're, go back to that idea of who's worthy in our society, right? I think it's like, well, you quit going to school, you have a low paying job or no job, so you're not worthy, right? Is that kind of narrative applies there?
Yeah. And those two chapters that you're talking about, I suggest that there's a growing recognition gap because the status of people with a college degree, of professionals and managers with a college degree, this is just, 30% of the population, 20, depending on how you look at it. It's more among the younger people. But if you look at the 60-year-olds, and as this group is constantly celebrated in popular culture, like if you think about entertainment television, it's very rare. And there are studies that demonstrate that it's very rare that you see a working class person there who's not a clown or a buffoon. Think about Bart Simpson, So for workers, people who do not have the college degree, there is a growing, I call it, recognition gap. This college degree increasingly act as a caste, those who are in, those who are out, and those who are middle class, who were able to buy a house 20 years ago, they benefited from what we call the asset economy. The value of the real estate has grown enormously. So they're sitting on their, pardon my French, on their butt doing nothing, and the value of their house is growing. And those who have not been able to enter the real estate market early don't experience at all this growth in wealth. And on the opposite, they're experiencing inflation, and it's increasingly difficult to pay their bills, So the story that the book tells in those first two chapters is really that addressing this recognition gap is not optional anymore. If you look at the major cities of the U.S., LA, San Francisco, Philadelphia, you go to these cities, you have enormous wealth that is next to an enormous population of homeless people. And those cities just are unable to cope with the disaster that has been created by this growing polarization. And a lot of the people who are homeless are people who have major mental health problems. And the local government simply cannot figure out how to address creating a better quality of life. And having so many people on the street, living on the street, is extremely bad, not only for those people, but also for society as a whole. Because as we walk with our children in these neighborhoods, we know it's inhumane, and we know that it's bad for everyone to be witnessing such human misery, right? So I think it's a problem that is really urgent, and that we need to figure out how to, and it's tied also to growing inequality. So the causes of this is not only, the wrong narrative. Don't mistake me for, my position is not in any way anti-economic. There's no question that creating a more equal society is really imperative in terms of distribution of resources. But we cannot address all the problems by only looking at how to distribute resources. We also have to think about how low-income people are deeply stigmatized in American society. It's much worse to be a poor person in the U.S. than it is to be a poor person in Canada or in Sweden, because of this notion of self-reliance. These people are presumed guilty, whereas in fact, a lot of them have mental health problems. That's partly genetic, So we need to kind of humanize the situation of people who live in poverty and think about how to address their situation.
Well, it seems like a pretty tall order to me. I mean, this is a big problem. And yes, I really appreciate your point here, is that changing narratives isn't the only piece of this, but that this is also part of it. How we look at people, who we humanize, who we deem as worthy, stigma. So I think that we have a good sense of why this is necessary for these narratives to shift and for us to all take a look at some of these narratives. How do we change the narrative at that cultural level? I mean, I know that's a huge question because obviously it's not easy, but what are your thoughts on that? How does this happen?
Yeah, the book draws on 185 interviews with what I call change agents. These are people whose profession it is to transform narrative. And I give a lot of examples. One of them is the case of the film Roma, which won an Oscar a few years ago. And that film is about indigenous maids working for a middle-class family in Mexico City. And in the film, you follow these two maids. One of them has to decide whether or not to get an abortion. And the film really humanizes them. Often the maids are like in the background. There's no story about them, but there the film is entirely centered on them. And it's really, really a powerful movie. What's interesting with this movie is it not only won an Oscar, but it also was shown on Netflix. And it was produced in part through the efforts of the Ford Foundation, which is one of the largest foundations in the U.S. And in the book, I talk about what I called recognition chains, which is alliances that are created between financially powerful organizations such as the Ford Foundation and the creators of a film like Roma. So what Ford did is it created, other organizations that are focused on narrative change. So the person who is president, Darren Walker, president of this foundation, is a gay man. When he became in charge of this enormous foundation 10 years ago, he decided that his mission was to fight inequality. And he was going to do this not only by distributing resources. There's always been a lot of economists coming up with schemes like moving to opportunity, the idea that you take poor people from a low-income neighborhood and you put them in another neighborhood that you see what happened to them. Well, instead of just focusing on these kinds of intervention, instead he said 4 pillars. One of them will be what he calls changing hearts and minds, which is to produce new narratives. So that's why they created this other organization within Ford called Just Film, which is creating films that have that contribute to the pursuit of social justice. And that played an important role in the film Roma, but they also joined forces with an organization called the National Alliance for Domestic Workers. And that's very important because domestic workers are often undocumented immigrants. They don't have any rights. They are very, very underpaid. And
overlooked, I would say, right?
Exactly.
I mean, often it's just, they're not seen at all, invisible.
Exactly. Yeah. So I interviewed a woman named Agent Pooh, who was one of the great leaders of unions in this country. And she was also consulted. This organization was also consulted in making that film. And it was a very purposeful attempt to transform, to destigmatize this group, to make it visible. It's not only about destigmatization, it's simply to make them visible. So that's a very good example, I think, of how you shed light on the reality of people who are typically being overlooked. And I should say, in another book I wrote, which is titled Getting Respect, with colleagues in Brazil and Israel, we did over 400 interviews with middle class and working class, African American, Black Brazilians, and 3 groups in Israel, which includes Ethiopian Jews, so Black people living in Israel. And we asked them, can you describe to us an incident where you feel you were treated unfairly? In the majority of cases, they don't talk about discrimination, which is not having access to housing or schools or jobs. Instead, they talk about this assault on the self, which means being invisible, underestimated, overlooked. So these are non-event. It's not like something calling you the N-word in the subway. These are non-events. The teacher never calls on you. You're in the background. No one pays attention to you. People think you're not smart enough because of the group you belong to. So the book also has 75 interviews with stand-up comics and Hollywood creatives. And it is very much about what strategies these professional groups are using to create recognition. And, we asked them about what's the motivation for the work they do. And very spontaneously, the vast majority of them told us, we're doing this to help, make visible, and often they themselves belong to invisible groups, or they have a stigmatized identity as queer people or whatever, or working class people or first gen in college. And a lot of what they do with their work is, of course, make people laugh. They don't want to force people to eat their vegetables. They know they have to make people laugh. But at the same time, they offer people support by saying, you and I were part of the same battle. We both want to fight this injustice, and a few of the people, 6 of the people we interviewed are white men, older white men. And those are the guys who took the position, that's called clapter, like you get people to support you just by being PC. I don't do this. But these are the very same men who tell extremely sexist jokes. And they don't think that's politics, you see. They think that's just normal. They're blind to the fact that when you take sexist jokes, you sexualize women, you treat them as object, it reinforces a gender hierarchy. So they have a vision of politics, everyday politics, that's very 1950s, and they're not aware of it. So
they don't see it, right?
Yeah, exactly.
They don't see it that way.
Exactly. It's a little bit like the film Mad Men. They just presume that's how the world works. They're
that's
not
the default.
Exactly.
Yeah. Well, your list of change agents was really interesting because you list some of the people you talked to in all these different industries and how you interviewed them to, and these really are people out there changing narratives and putting things in popular culture and in art. And I love that you honed in on the comedy example because that's my idea of a way to relax in the evening is just watch sketches of comedy. And I think it's so interesting how people are using humor to reach people in a way that's more palatable, I guess, because it's funny, but it's really on the edge. And I think that's probably part of why comedians are always getting themselves into trouble because they do. I mean, some don't, but a lot of them, it's like they're walking this edge of kind of pushing us to look at things in a different way and using humor, which is a pretty complicated skill. I think it's pretty impressive that people can do that.
Yeah, and I think given that you're a clinical psychologist, I think it's very interesting how a growing number of them are talking also about mental health. They make jokes about their own mental health and about what a mess they are, but I think it also very much normalizes and humanizes the fact of having mental health issues, that everyone has them sometimes, and it doesn't mean that you're crazy or abnormal, So that has played a very important role in the diffusion of what we call the therapeutic culture, right? And another group of respondents in the book are Gen Zs. I had 2 graduate students who are, of course, much younger than me, do 80 interviews with Gen Zs, who are people born after 97. And they're all in college. Some of them, half of them are from privileged families. They're middle class. The other half is less privileged. And the question we asked them was about what are the challenges of your life today, and what do you not like in our society, and what would you change? So, and one of the findings is that, they value work and they want to have an entrepreneurial attitude toward their life, but they also feel very strongly that you need to have a work-life balance. And they really value having a balanced life, So that's very different from the boomers, my generation, where the level of awareness about mental health was pretty minimal. And experts now talk about, both healthism, the culture of health, not only mental health, but also physical health, the fact that people are going to gym. And it's become a culture that can become perverse too if people are so obsessed with maximizing their performance at all levels. But the focus on mental health is very much part of that. And that generation also is, I agree in the book that they really, for them, the American dream means nothing because the generation that preceded them, the millennials, they went on the job market just with the collapse of the economy in 2008. Many of them were never able to buy a house. Many of them are climate skeptic. They feel that they are doomers. They don't want to have children because they're too anxious about what's going to happen with the environment. And the Gen Zs share a lot of these characteristics. And when you ask them about their view of the future, they say, well, for me, really, they're very critical of consumption, of course, because they tie this to the ecological disaster, that we just need too many clothes and blah, blah, blah. And they say, my goal is really not to get on what they call the hedonistic treadmill of consumption. You buy a dress today, you need another one tomorrow and a pair of shoes the next day. And all this purchase leaves you empty because it's really, in fact, not what you want. What you need and what you want is being seen by others, feeling that you matter in the eyes of others. And this is something that only human beings can do for each other. The new car won't do that for you, even if you think people will appreciate you more because you have a fancy car. In fact, many people will like you less because you have a fancy car. So those Gen Zs are really reorienting their life view, their life goals towards something that is universally available, which is the construction of a more inclusive society. And I think they're concerned with the pronouns, which many boomers don't understand. What's that? A non-binary pronoun, calling people them instead of he and she, or the unisex bathroom that many Gen Zs are fighting because they think I'm not male or female. A recent survey shows that 30% of the Gen Zs, the women, self-define as bisexual. So they want to relate to others as human beings. For them, whether you're male or female, if you're a beautiful person, a soul that you want to communicate with, that's really what they seek. So they really want to downplay binary gender identification just as much as they want to downplay the color of your skin or whether immigrant or not. So it's part of their general celebration of what in the book I call ordinary universalism, which is basically what we all share as human beings. Like, what do all humans have in common, the essence of human beings. And just anecdotally, another little story about this notion of ordinary universalism. Another book I wrote is titled The Dignity of Working Man, and that's a book that compares Black and white workers in New York and white and North African workers in France. And as part of that book, I did a number of interviews with North African immigrants working in France. So those are the guys who at the time their job was to clean, phone booths, or roofers, who spend their day under the sun with kneeling and asphalt, the most terrible jobs that you can imagine. And there was a lot of racism toward Muslim North African immigrants in France then, as there's today. So I asked them, what it is that make you similar and different from French people. And these are, for the most part, totally illiterate people, people with just a few years of schooling. But they would draw on anecdotes from everyday life, things that are self-evident to them, common knowledge, like, oh, we all spend 9 months in our mother's womb, or we all have 10 fingers, or we're all children of God, or we're all have to buy our bread in the morning at the bakery, or we're all, insignificant in the cosmos. We're all like grains of salt. So they all talked about this ordinary universalism, what is incontestably true about all of them. So another theme that is very central to the book is the celebration and how we can shed more light on, what we all have in common. And that includes the search for dignity. This is something that all human beings want. And racist people want it too for themselves, So how can we figure, and this is not zero sum. It's not like a pie where if I have a big piece, you have a small piece, everyone can get dignity at once. So the book spends a lot of time discussing how to spread dignity to the largest number, as I said already earlier.
Yeah, and I think within ordinary universalism, as I was reading in your book, it's kind of both and, right? It's both what we have in common, what all people are looking for, and also embracing differences. So it's not about making everyone the same. It's more about being accepted for who you are, whoever you are, right? And I think that's kind of an important thing too. It's not, because it's not the same as a minimalization of the differences. Like,
not at all. Not at all.
It's not at all. Yeah.
Yeah. It's not like assimilation, we're going to be viewed as valued because we all change our Jewish name into WASP name, which were conditions for assimilation in the US in the 60s. It's more like, we're essentially different as people, but yet we share a lot, and let's celebrate what we share. And one of the things we should share is our desire to have a more inclusive society. So,
yeah. I want to go back just a little bit to this idea of young people. I think a lot about my daughters and how different I do think there's been a change since I was a kid. So I'm Generation X, and I think about some of the narratives that I grew up with, cultural narratives as a kind of middle class white person in America versus what they're learning. And I guess I just feel like it gives me a little bit of hope. And you gave some examples already, but I think of some of the things that my children are learning that's different from what I learned or what I was exposed to. I think that I had to kind of do some work to question and examine and maybe unlearn some narratives. And so I don't know, do you feel more hopeful when you talk to the younger generation? I know there's a bit of a backlash too against that, obviously going on if you follow the news, but
yeah, I think they're often depicted as snowflakes who are too concerned with themselves and too self-centered and too fragile. But I feel like a lot of the work that they're doing toward greater inclusion is very positive. So in the book, we interviewed them because I think the change comes from the top, people whose job it is to diffuse narratives that will, influence society at large. But it's also a bottom-up project. And these young people, they're just living their life, but they're influenced by their peers, and they're also influenced by the media. So they do a lot of transformation work on a daily basis in how they want to live on a daily basis. And I see it, for instance, I teach a lot of graduate students. Well, graduate students, they're extremely intolerant towards sexual harassment, or even the idea that an older man would have a girlfriend who's 20 years old is repugnant to them, really. And I grew up in a generation where, people didn't think it was a good idea, but people were not there was not the same level of intolerance toward that. Many old professors thought that having a young graduate student as a partner was part of the side benefits, So I think their moral outrage toward inequality and domination and power is kind of very healthy. And my book, I think, is very helpful. Hopeful. And it's hopeful because, in part, this generation, which has had a lot of mental health problems during the pandemic, has had to think hard and, really hard about how do we move forward. And for them, that's the answer, because just pursuing the American dream just won't do it for them, So you can see them as doomers who are really discouraged and dropping the ball. But on the other hand, many of them are stepping up. And it's also a generation that's self-defined as very political. There's the Black Lives Matter. And also there's huge increase now in unionization in the U.S., and many of those who are behind these movements are young workers in the service sector who are asking for basic conditions that are more humane, such as, for instance, the Amazon workers who wanted time to go to the restroom, or the Starbucks workers who wanted the permission to put a rainbow flag in their shop, So they are demands that are not only economic demands. One could think, having a restroom break is nothing, it's crumbs. No, it's not crumbs. If for them it is a symbol of their humanity and their dignity. Or I was told recently, I did the podcast with the station that caters to truck drivers. And the person who was interviewing me was saying, well, one of the main demands in the UPS strike was to have air conditioning in the cabin. Again, the question of basic human dignity, that if you're going to have that job, there are lots of conditions that can be just to improve your well-being. And this is a point of pride too, so I think the book is hopeful in part because it points toward a better future, as opposed to many people are now writing on the polarized society, the cancel culture, how woke culture is terrible. I don't line up with these people at all. I'm much more, I don't think that they criticize identity politics because they think that fighting for identity is meaningless. And I would say I position myself very much in opposition to their views because I take identity and dignity very seriously. So,
yeah, and I think one thing that's happening and that is hopeful is that challenge of the status quo. I love that example of sexual harassment. And I remember, I was, in college and graduate school when everything was going on with Bill Clinton and his, that thing with his infidelity.
Yeah.
Some of that was going on, I believe, kind of the tail end of it when I was in William James Hall, where I sit today. And I remember some of the commentary that I heard often from older men with, well, of course, that's just the way it is. That's how powerful men act. And there's this challenge of status quo around that, around working conditions, which is, well, it doesn't have to be. What if we just all decide that's not okay? No. And so that kind of speaking up, and I think your book is a contribution to that as well. It's questioning some of those narratives that we've just taken as, well, that's how it is. And we can say, well, it doesn't really have to be like that if we decide we don't want it to be like that anymore.
Exactly.
Yeah. One of your chapters, chapter 8, was on solutions for building a more inclusive society. And I thought that was a really important one. I mean, people can read the book and dive into a lot more details around that, but you talk about things like institutions, families, schools, ways that we can work toward building connections among groups. And I thought, there's so much we could even dive in. That could be its own interview, just talking about that chapter. But I thought maybe we could use myself as an example. So I'm a middle-aged, educated white woman in America and a mother of 2 kids who are in school, public school. What are some of the things that I can do personally to, work toward a more inclusive society? I mean, obviously, there's a lot of cultural and systemic change as well. But do you have anything that comes to mind around what a person like me could do?
Absolutely. I think in the middle class, there's a big obsession with what sociologists call opportunity hoarding, which is to give as many advantages to their kids as possible. And we do this by moving to schools districts that have, better performance and, maybe screening quite carefully who the kids' friends are going to be. At the same time, the book in chapter 1 has a table showing the enormous increase in class segregation in the U.S., the frequency at which people with college degrees, professionals and managers interact with people who don't have a college degree has increased really dramatically over the last decades. And I think that's a problem because it means that upper middle class people are so distant now from the non-college educated that it's very easy to have a caricatural view of them, to be scared of them, to want to keep your kids away from them, and to really not understand the conditions that lead to poverty. So to me, that's a huge problem. So I think we vote with our feet every day when we decide what activities we're going to get our kids involved and who are going to be, how we navigate their friendship and how we model to them whether or not we want to be living in a socioeconomic bubble or really cultivate a wider range of friends. So I think middle-class parents need to engage in self-examination because in terms of how we navigate those aspects of our kids' life, because just creating for them an environment where they live, on the extremely isolated, self-protected life where they never encounter anyone who's different from them is a preparation for disaster, because then it really teaches them that the value of people is essentially their socioeconomic standing, and that if they don't perform at that level, they won't be loved and they won't be appreciated. And that feeds also the anxiety among kids. So that's very important, I think. And also there's, as you know, in the US, a big movement against NIMBYism, not in my backyard. People don't want affordable housing built in there. My own, where I live in Brookline, Massachusetts, we're just now going through a big campaign. The governor decided that in order any neighborhood that is served by the subway has to have a certain number of affordable housing in close proximity to also fight pollution, and then there's a lot of politics in town about how this should be. And a lot of people are opposing affordable housing, multi-story buildings. They have prejudices against renters. Well, I think this is another level that we can really kind of do some self-examining to think, what are we doing here when we want our kids to only hang out with children of dentists? They can be quite boring, the children of dentists. Do you really want your kid to just hang out with vanilla, upper middle class kids? I don't know.
Yeah, it's a little bit about, I think, both the affordable housing example and the parenting example. I think a lot of people, I've seen this so much where it's, in theory, we want diversity, want inclusivity, but we also bubble ourselves up. If, people of privilege can sort of opt out of being directly, to have their own life involved in that, and to, we need to stop that, right? We need to put this into practice in our own lives by not just staying in that little bubble, I think.
Exactly. And then parents measure their own value by, let's see, what kind of college their kids end up being accepted. Well, in fact, a great many colleges are fantastic. I mean, people could be critical of me saying, of course, you teach at Harvard. It's easy for you to say that. But I think too much is made of the very top of the hierarchy. While in reality, the vast majority of people, like something like 50% of American students, go to community colleges. These, flagship R1 research universities serve a very tiny part of the population. And upper middle class parents can be really obsessed with where their kids go to college, as if it was the emblem of their success as parents. Well, no, I think our success as parents should be measured by how happy our kids are, not by what kind of
are they decent human beings or not, not what school they went to. Yeah. And actually, we can link in our show notes for today's episode to a few episodes. I did an episode a while back on social justice parenting, about not just parenting your own child, but parenting for the world and for all the children. Recently, my co-host Emily interviewed someone on toxic achievement culture and how that can be so problematic when we're raising kids. So, this is a topic that I think if you happen to be interested in this and you're listening, I think this is a very important conversation for parents. Yes. And we are winding down our interview today. So I want to ask one final question, which, kind of just putting you on the spot here with this one. But if you could change one narrative, if you could take one narrative or just something going on related to this concept of worthiness and which groups we deem are worthy, what change would you love to see in the world, if you're being really aspirational here?
Well, I think it's exactly what we were just talking about, people confusing social status with worth. I think for many upper middle class people, those two things go hand in hand. They think they're worthy because they have a college degree and a professional job. But for many workers, their concept of worth is not about their status. They have low status, objectively, when you look at prestige measures, but they might think they're very worthy. But when they talk about their worth, and I saw that in my book, The Dignity Working Man, it's all about their moral worth, being there for their friends, being there for their children, not dropping their friends when they become unemployed, trying to be good parents, keeping their kids out of trouble, and being a hard worker and carrying their own weight. So I think we kind of need more of a collective conversation about this relationship between morality and worth in our society. So I would say I would conclude with that, I think.
That's a great one. I think if that were to shift, a lot would change for the better in our society.
Absolutely. Mm-hmm. Exactly.
Well, thank you so much for coming on the show today. Let me just read the title of your book again for people who found this interesting. I really recommend reading the book. It's called Seeing Others: How Recognition Works and How It Can Heal a Divided World.
Well, thank you so much. I really appreciate being invited. I enjoyed the conversation, Debbie.
Me too. I enjoyed it very much. Thank you for coming on and spending some time with us. And thank you for the important work you're doing. I do think that just even, like you said earlier, shining a light on these narratives, that alone makes a difference. So thank you, Michele. I really, really appreciate it.
Thank you. And have a good day.
You too. Thank you.
Thank you for listening to Psychologists Off the Clock. If you enjoy our podcast, you can help us out by leaving a review or contributing on Patreon.
You can get more psychology tips by subscribing to our newsletter and connecting with us on social media.
We'd like to thank our podcast production manager, Jadine Stout Williams.
This podcast is for informational and entertainment purposes only and is not meant to be a substitute for mental health treatment. If you're looking for mental health treatment, please visit the resources page of our website, offtheclockpsych.com.